Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that history tried very hard to erase. The love stories that weren't supposed to exist. We're stepping into the world of enslaved people in America. Not to talk about chains or cotton fields, but to explore something far more intimate. Marriage, family, the desperate, defiant act of loving someone when the law said you weren't even a person. Forget the sanitized versions you might have heard. The reality was beautiful and brutal in equal measure. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a one-room cabin somewhere in the American South. The year is 1842, and the walls around you are rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and straw. Gaps let in the cold, the mosquitoes, and the faint sounds of the plantation settling into evening. The floor beneath your bare feet is packed dirt, cool and slightly damp. You've been working since before dawn, and every muscle in your body aches with the specific exhaustion that comes from labor that isn't yours to profit from. Your hands are calloused, your back permanently curved from bending, and your skin carries the smell of sweat, earth, and whatever crop defines your existence this season. But tonight, something different stirs in your chest. You've noticed someone whose laugh cuts through the monotony of the fields, someone whose eyes meet yours across the rows of tobacco or rice or cotton. And now you're wondering if maybe, just maybe, there's a way to build something that belongs only to you. Here's the thing about falling in love when you're enslaved. Every tender feeling comes wrapped in terror. Because you don't own yourself. You don't own your time, your body, or your future. And you certainly don't own the right to decide who shares your life. The person you're drawn to might belong to the same enslaver, which is convenient in the cruelest sense. Or they might belong to a neighboring plantation, which means every moment together becomes a negotiation with people who see you as property. You can't court freely. You can't propose on your own terms. Before anything happens, before any promise is made, you need permission. Permission from the person who owns you. Permission from the person who owns them. And those permissions can be denied for any reason or no reason at all. Imagine gathering the courage to approach your enslaver. You stand with your hat in your hands, eyes carefully lowered, voice steady despite the pounding in your chest. You're asking for the right to love someone, and the person you're asking might grant it cheerfully, seeing an opportunity to breed more workers. Or they might deny it because they're in a bad mood, because they have other plans for you, because they simply enjoy the power of saying no. Your entire emotional future hangs on the whim of someone who doesn't consider you fully human. Welcome to courtship in the antebellum South. And even if you receive that precious permission, it can be revoked at any moment. Your enslaver might change their mind next week, next month, next year. The ground beneath your relationship is never stable. It shifts with the moods and finances of people who view your love as an inconvenience at best, an investment opportunity at worst. Let's say permission is granted. Congratulations. Now comes the process of actually building a relationship, which looks nothing like the courtship rituals of free society happening just miles away in the big house. You don't have leisure time. You don't have money to buy gifts. You don't have the luxury of slow Sunday strolls or letters sealed with wax. What you have is stolen moments, a conversation by the well at twilight, a walk together when you're both assigned to the same errand, a glance across the fields that says everything words cannot. These moments are precious because they're rare. You might work 16 hours in a day and have only 15 minutes with the person you love. You learn to compress entire conversations into looks, entire declarations into the brush of fingertips as you pass. The language of love becomes something silent, something the overseers can't quite catch, something that lives in the spaces between words. If the person you love belongs to another plantation, these moments become even more precious and precarious. You might only see them on Sundays, if you're lucky enough to have Sundays off, and if you can get a pass to travel. A pass, a piece of paper that grants you temporary permission to move your own body from one place to another. Without it, you're subject to patrols, those roving groups of white men whose job is to catch enslaved people traveling without authorization. Getting caught could mean a beating. Getting caught repeatedly could mean your courting privileges revoked entirely. So you walk the dark roads with your pass clutched tight, your ears straining for hoofbeats, your heart divided between fear and longing. The night air smells of pine and damp earth. Every snapped twig makes you freeze. Every distant voice sends your heart racing. And yet you keep walking, mile after mile, because at the end of that road is someone worth the risk. The courting rituals that developed in enslaved communities were their own beautiful creations, born from necessity and defiance. You might bring small gifts when you could manage them. A ribbon acquired through trade, a carved wooden comb made with your own hands during precious evening hours when you should have been sleeping. The carving took weeks. Small moments stolen after exhaustion should have claimed you, but you wanted to give something, anything that proved your devotion. You might sing to the person you loved, songs that carried double meanings, songs that spoke of freedom and devotion in the same breath. Music was one thing that couldn't be entirely controlled, and so it became a language of courtship, of hope, of everything that had to stay unspoken in daylight. The melodies drifted through the quarters in the evening, carrying messages that only those who knew the codes could understand. Community elders often played matchmaker, suggesting unions, advising young people, trying to guide relationships towards stability in a world designed to destroy them. These weren't just romantic gestures. They were acts of cultural preservation, ways of maintaining human dignity when the entire system insisted you had none. So you've courted, you've loved, you've navigated the impossible maze of permissions and patrols and stolen moments. Now you want to make it official, you want to marry. And here's where the cruelty becomes almost absurd in its totality. Your marriage will not be legal. Not in any court, not in any church that matters to the law, not in any document that carries weight. You can stand before a preacher, speak vows, exchange promises of forever, and none of it will protect you from being separated tomorrow. The phrase that haunted enslaved marriages was not "till death do us part." It was "till death or distance do us part." Some ceremonies made this explicit, the words spoken aloud as a grim acknowledgement of reality. You're not just promising love. You're promising to love despite the knowledge that any day, any hour, your spouse could be sold away, and you might never see them again. That shadow hangs over every moment of joy, every quiet evening together, every plan you dare to make. The wedding itself, though, was real, deeply, profoundly real. Communities gathered to witness these unions with as much solemnity and joy as any free wedding. The most iconic tradition was jumping the broom. You and your beloved would hold hands, and together you'd leap over a broom laid on the ground. The symbolism varied by community. Some said it represented sweeping away the old and starting fresh. Others connected it to African traditions carried across the water in memory and adapted to new soil. What mattered was that it meant something. It created a moment that belonged to you, that the enslaver could witness but never truly own. The broom itself might be decorated with ribbons if ribbons could be found, or simply left plain, a working tool transformed into a sacred object by the intention behind the leap. The height of your jump, some believed, predicted the balance of power in your marriage. Jump high, and you'd have a partnership of equals. Stumble, and perhaps one would lead more than the other. People laughed at this, but they also watched carefully. After the jump, there might be music, dancing, food, if it could be gathered. A feast made from whatever could be saved or grown, or quietly taken from the big house kitchen. Sweet potatoes maybe, cornbread. If someone had managed to catch a possum or rabbit, there might even be meat. You'd eat together, your community surrounding you, their presence a form of protection. A promise that even if the law didn't recognize your union, they did. The taste of that food, whatever it was, would stay with you. Years later, you'd remember the exact flavor of that cornbread, the way the firelight caught your beloved's face, the sound of voices raised in song as the night deepened around you. Someone might play a fiddle or a banjo, instruments crafted from gourds and animal hide, sounds that carried memories of Africa adapted to American soil. The dancing would last until exhaustion claimed everyone, until even the joy of celebration couldn't overcome the knowledge that dawn would bring another day of labor. But not everyone got even this much. Some enslavers refused to allow ceremonies at all, seeing them as dangerous, indulgences that gave enslaved people ideas about autonomy. Others insisted on presiding over the weddings themselves, turning what should have been a moment of joy into another display of control. Imagine standing there, speaking your vows, while the person who owns you watches with proprietary satisfaction, knowing that they see this moment not as your love story, but as a transaction, a breeding arrangement, an investment in future laborers. The intimacy of the moment invaded by the gaze of power. Your words feel hollow even as you mean them with everything you have. Some couples chose to marry in secret, conducting their own ceremonies in the quarters after dark, witnessed only by those they trusted. These hidden marriages were acts of rebellion, assertions of humanity that didn't require white approval to be valid. The risk of discovery was real, but so was the need for something that belonged entirely to you. Your wedding night is nothing like what free couples experience. There's no honeymoon, no privacy, no time set aside for the beginning of your new life together. Tomorrow, you'll both be back in the fields at dawn, your bodies belonging to someone else's profit. If you're lucky and you both belong to the same plantation, you might share a cabin now. More likely, you'll squeeze into space that already houses others, your wedding bed separated from the rest of the room by nothing more than a hung blanket, if you have one to spare. The cabin is small, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, and it holds your entire married life. Cooking happens at the fireplace in the corner, smoke staining the low ceiling black. Sleep happens on a pallet stuffed with corn husks or moss, the rustling following every movement you make. Intimacy happens in whispered darkness, always aware of the thin walls, the nearby bodies, the complete absence of anything resembling solitude. The smell of smoke never quite leaves the air. The sound of others breathing, coughing, shifting in. Their sleep becomes the soundtrack of your marriage. You learn to find privacy in small ways, in moments, in the particular silence that falls when everyone pretends not to hear. If your spouse belongs to another plantation, your reality is something called an abroad marriage. Congratulations, you're married to someone you might see once a week. If everything goes perfectly, your husband or wife lives miles away, and every visit requires permission, travel, and timing that never quite works in your favor. You spend your nights alone in your cabin, missing someone you're legally bound to in the eyes of your community, but completely separated from in practice. The empty space beside you on the pallet feels like an accusation. You lie awake listening to the sounds of the quarters, wondering if your spouse is doing the same, wondering if they're safe, wondering when you'll see them again. Sundays become everything. You wake before dawn to walk the distance, arriving with just enough time to share a meal, talk about the week, hold each other for precious hours before you have to leave again. The walk back is always harder than the walk there, each step taking you further from the person you love, the darkness deeper, the silence heavier. Some couples in abroad marriages only saw each other monthly. Some, during busy seasons, went even longer. The loneliness was its own form of torture, loving someone you couldn't reach, building a family you couldn't live with, and children. Let's talk about children, because this is where the horror becomes almost unbearable to contemplate. You want a family. You want the normal human experience of raising children with the person you love. But every child you bring into the world is born into slavery. Your baby, from their first breath, belongs to whoever owns you. They're recorded in ledgers alongside livestock, their names written in the same ink that tracks horses and cattle. Their value is assessed based on health, future labor, potential, and how much they might fetch at auction. You hold your newborn in your arms, smell that particular sweetness of baby skin, feel their fingers curl around yours, and you know with absolute certainty that you have no power to protect them. They can be sold at any age. Mothers were separated from nursing infants, their milk still flowing as they were loaded onto carts headed elsewhere. Toddlers were taken from families and sent to different plantations. Children old enough to work were especially vulnerable to sale, their growing bodies representing value that enslavers were eager to capitalize on. The specific cruelty of this system is hard to overstate. You love your children with the same fierce, all-consuming love that any parent feels. But that love comes with constant grinding fear. Every time an enslaver has financial troubles, you wonder if your child will be the one sold to cover debts. Every time a stranger visits the plantation, you watch their eyes and pray, they're not here to buy. You try to prepare your children for a world that will treat them as property, teaching them survival skills, obedience strategies, the careful art of navigating white authority without losing themselves entirely. You want to give them hope, but you also have to give them realism. Some parents made the agonizing choice not to name their children immediately, waiting to see if the infant would survive the brutal conditions of early life. Others poured extra meaning into names, choosing words that carried prayers and aspirations in the languages the enslavers couldn't understand. A name was sometimes the only inheritance you could guarantee. You whispered it over your child in the darkness, a secret gift that couldn't be taken away. Mothers faced particular horrors. Pregnancy offered no relief from labor. You worked in the fields until your body could no longer manage it, your belly swelling beneath the sun, your back screaming with a pain that had no remedy. Then, you returned to work as soon as possible after giving birth, sometimes within days. Some women delivered babies in the fields themselves, surrounded by other workers who helped however they could, before overseers demanded everyone return to their tasks. The dirt beneath you, the sky above, and a circle of women who understood because they'd been there too. Nursing was complicated by work schedules. Some plantations had nurseries where infants were left during the day, tended by elderly women too old for field work. You might have only brief periods to nurse your child, rushing from the fields when permitted, your body aching both from labor and from the fullness of milk. The bond between mother and child formed under these conditions was no less powerful for being constrained. If anything, the precariousness intensified the devotion. Every moment with your child felt borrowed, stolen, precious beyond measure. Let's say the worst happens. Let's say you wake up one morning and discover that your spouse or your child has been sold. Maybe there was warning. Rumors that traveled through the quarters, whispered from cabin to cabin in the darkness. Maybe you had a few days to say goodbye, to hold each other one last time, to make promises you both knew couldn't be kept. You tried to memorize everything, the exact shade of their eyes, the sound of their laugh, the way they moved, walked, breathed. You pressed these details into your memory like flowers into a book, trying to preserve something that was about to be destroyed. Or maybe there was no warning at all. Your husband went to the fields as usual and simply didn't return. Your daughter was taken while you were working, her small body loaded onto a cart that disappeared down the road before anyone could tell you. You came back to the cabin and found only absence. The grief of this separation was considered one of the deepest sufferings of slavery. Formerly enslaved people who later recorded their stories described it in terms usually reserved for death, because it was a kind of death. Your family member still existed somewhere in the world, still breathed and walked and maybe thought of you, but they were as lost to you as if they'd been buried in the ground. More painful, perhaps, because death has finality. Separation has hope, that thin, cruel thread of hope that maybe someday, somehow, you'll find each other again. The auction block was where many of these separations happened. If you've ever seen depictions of slave auctions, you might think you understand. You don't. Imagine standing on a platform while strangers examine your body, your teeth, your muscle tone. Hands that you don't want touching you, turning your face, squeezing your arms, making you walk back and forth like an animal at market. Now imagine watching your child stand on that same platform while someone evaluates their worth in dollars. Your child, who you taught to walk, whose tears you wiped, whose laughter was the only good thing in your days. Families pleaded to be sold together. Sometimes these pleas were ignored entirely. Sometimes they were used as leverage to drive prices up. A mother willing to do anything to stay with her children might fetch more money if sold to someone who promised not to separate them, promises that were rarely kept. The sounds of these auctions, the crying, the shouting of prices, the final crack of the auctioneer's voice declaring sold, haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Those sounds echoed in dreams, surfacing unexpectedly at moments of quiet, a trauma that never quite healed. Some families did find each other. After emancipation, newly freed people placed advertisements in newspapers, desperately searching for loved ones sold away years or decades before. These ads are heartbreaking documents. They describe distinguishing features, last known locations, the names of former enslavers. They represent the continuation of love across impossible distances and years. Information about Sam, my husband, sold from me in Richmond in 1853. He had a scar over his left eye and walked with a slight limp. Any information would be gratefully received. These advertisements ran for years, some for decades, their authors refusing to give up hope. Some searches succeeded. Husbands and wives reunited after 20, 30 years apart. Parents found children who'd grown into adults they didn't recognize. The stories of these reunions are almost unbearably moving. People who had carried each other in memory for decades, finally able to touch, to speak, to confirm that the other person had survived. But many searches ended in silence. The loved one had died, moved too far to be traced, or simply vanished into the vast cruelty of the system. Some people searched until their own deaths, never finding, never knowing. But here's what the history of enslaved marriage also teaches us. And this is the part that might help you sleep tonight rather than lie awake in horror. People loved anyway. They married anyway. They had children anyway, despite knowing what those children would face. They built communities, created traditions, maintained hope against all evidence that hope was reasonable. The wedding ceremonies continued. The courting rituals evolved and adapted. The jumping of brooms happened in thousands of secret and public moments across the South, each one a declaration that love was stronger than law, that humanity couldn't be owned even when bodies could. Enslaved people didn't have the luxury of giving up on love because the circumstances were bad. They chose connection precisely because everything around them demanded isolation. They built families because family was resistance. Every marriage was an act of faith in a future that the system said shouldn't exist for them. The marriages themselves often showed remarkable resilience. Couples who'd been together for decades developed partnerships that distributed labor, shared resources, and provided mutual support in ways that made survival slightly more possible. Husbands might tend small gardens in evening hours, growing food to supplement the inadequate rations provided by enslavers. The smell of those gardens, rich earth and growing things, became the smell of hope itself. Collard greens, sweet potatoes, black-eyed peas, crops that could sustain bodies the system wanted to break. Wives might sew, mend, and create from scraps the small comforts that made cabin life bearable. A quilt pieced together from worn-out clothes became more than warmth. It became a record of family, each patch holding memories. Together, they created households that functioned despite every structural force working against them. They raised children who knew they were loved, even when they couldn't be protected. They built communities that remembered birthdays and anniversaries, that mourned separations and celebrated reunions, that maintained the social fabric the system tried to tear apart. Religion played a complex role in these marriages. Many enslaved people adopted Christianity, sometimes forced, sometimes chosen, and often transformed into something the white churches wouldn't recognize. In the hidden spaces of the slave quarters, preachers who were themselves enslaved conducted services that blended African traditions with Christian theology. These gatherings were illegal, dangerous, and essential. Hush harbors, they were sometimes called, secret worship spaces in the woods or swamps, where voices could be raised without white ears hearing. The God they worshipped understood suffering. The heaven they imagined promised reunion with separated loved ones. The marriage ceremonies conducted by these preachers carried spiritual weight that transcended legal invisibility. When an enslaved preacher pronounced a couple married, the community believed it, and that belief created reality. Not legal reality, but something perhaps more durable. A spiritual bond that couldn't be dissolved by sale or distance. The words spoken over those unions echoed in hearts long after the ceremonies ended, long after separations tore families apart, long after everything else was taken away. The physical intimacy of enslaved marriage happened in conditions that made privacy nearly impossible. Your cabin was small, crowded, and offered no separation between daily life and intimate moments. Children might sleep on pallets, feet away from where parents lay together. Other families might share the same structure, their blanket walls the only boundary between households. The sounds of the night, creaking wood, wind through gaps, the movements of others, became a kind of privacy themselves, covering what needed to be covered. And yet intimacy happened. People found ways to create moments of connection, to maintain the physical relationship that was part of their bond. They developed signals, understood silences, learned each other's rhythms in ways that transcended the cramped conditions. The resourcefulness required to sustain a marriage under these conditions speaks to both the strength of enslaved people and the cruelty of a system that denied them even basic human privacy. Some enslavers actively interfered in the intimate lives of enslaved couples. The practice of forced breeding was real and horrifying. Enslaved women were sometimes paired with men not of their choosing, their bodies treated as reproductive resources. Enslaved men were sometimes used as studs, forced to father children with multiple women regardless of their own marriages. These practices existed alongside and in tension with the marriages enslaved people chose for themselves. A woman might be married to a man she loved while simultaneously being violated by the enslaver or forced to bear children with others. The psychological torture of this dual existence, trying to maintain a genuine marriage while having no control over your own body, represents one of slavery's deepest cruelties. And yet marriages survived even this. Couples found ways to maintain their bond, despite violations that would seem to make such bonds impossible. The love persisted, carrying wounds, but persisting nonetheless. Let's move through a typical day in an enslaved marriage, because the rhythm of daily life is where love actually lived. You wake before dawn to the sound of the horn or bell that signals the start of work. The cabin is cold, the fire burned down to embers, and the darkness outside is absolute. Your spouse is beside you, warm in the brief moment before the cold reality of the day begins. Maybe you have time to speak a few words. Maybe you simply look at each other, that look containing everything you can't say aloud. A touch of hands, quick and secret, before you're both up, moving, preparing for labor that will consume the next 12 to 16 hours. If you're lucky, you work near each other. You might catch glimpses throughout the day, exchange a word. During water breaks, know that the other person is present, even if you can't be together. If you're unlucky, your work takes you to different parts of the plantation, and the day becomes an exercise in waiting, enduring, counting hours until evening. Evening brings its own challenges. You return to the cabin exhausted, hungry, with barely enough energy to prepare food from the meager rations you've been given. The rations themselves were calculated to provide just enough sustenance to keep you working, nothing more. Maybe you have a small garden plot, tended in whatever fragments of time you can steal from sleep. The vegetables from that garden make the difference between adequate nutrition and constant hunger. You cook together, or one cooks, while the other handles the endless small tasks of survival. Children need attention. The cabin needs maintenance. There's always something worn that needs mending. And yet, within this exhaustion, there are moments. A touch as you pass each other in the small space. A joke that makes you both laugh despite everything. The comfort of sleeping beside someone who knows you, who shares your burden, who loves you in a world that insists you're unlovable. These moments were what people lived for. Not grand gestures, but small intimacies that proved humanity persisted. Sundays, for those who had them off, became sacred time for marriages. It was the one day when labor might pause, when couples could actually spend hours together rather than minutes. If you were in an abroad marriage, Sunday was when you traveled to be with your spouse, setting out in the darkness to maximize your time together. If you lived together, Sunday was when you could actually talk, plan, dream. Some couples spent Sundays attending religious services together, their shared faith another bond strengthening the marriage. Others spent the day on their own small projects, building up the household, caring for children, trying to accumulate the tiny fragments of stability the system otherwise denied. The quality of light on a Sunday afternoon felt different. The air tasted of something almost like freedom. You could sit with your spouse, really sit, without the overseer's eye, without the relentless demand of labor, and remember what it meant to be fully human together. The community surrounding an enslaved marriage was itself a crucial support system. Older women advised younger wives, sharing knowledge about childbirth, about managing households on nothing, about surviving the unsurvivable. Experienced fathers counseled new husbands, teaching them how to protect families they had no legal right to protect. When couples fought, which they did because they were human and stress was constant and resources were scarce, community members often mediated. When children misbehaved, the whole community might participate in discipline and instruction. The phrase "it takes a village" wasn't an abstraction. It was survival strategy. Your marriage existed within a web of relationships that sustained it, celebrated it, and mourned when it was torn apart. These communities developed their own standards for marriage, their own expectations for husbands and wives, their own ways of handling divorce and separation that operated entirely outside white legal systems. Some marriages did end by choice rather than force. The stresses of enslaved life broke some couples. Infidelity happened, sometimes chosen and sometimes coerced. Some people simply grew apart, their initial connection unable to survive years of grinding hardship. Community responses to these situations varied, but generally there were established ways to handle marital dissolution that allowed both parties to move on, potentially remarrying within the community. These weren't formal divorces in any legal sense, but they were recognized separations that allowed people to rebuild their lives. The community witnessed these endings just as they witnessed beginnings, providing structure and meaning in a world that offered neither. As you lie in your own bed tonight, comfortable and free in ways those enslaved couples never were, think about what they built. They created functional marriages without any legal protection. They raised children to be resilient despite knowing those children might be stolen. They maintained hope despite constant evidence that hope was foolish. They loved deeply, truly, with the full force of human emotion, in circumstances designed to make love impossible. Every wedding ceremony was an act of defiance. Every child born to married parents was a statement of faith in the future. Every couple that stayed together through separations, losses, and daily degradations proved that human connection can survive nearly anything. After emancipation, one of the first things freed people did was formalize their marriages. They lined up at churches and courthouses to have ceremonies that now carried legal weight. They took surnames, often choosing new ones that symbolized their freedom: Freeman, Liberty, Justice, names that meant something after generations of being named by others. They searched desperately for family members sold away. They built households finally protected by law, finally free from the threat of separation by sale. But they also carried with them the traditions developed in slavery. The jumping of the broom continued, not out of necessity, but out of honor for what their ancestors had created. The community-centered approach to marriage persisted. The deep understanding that love is an act of resistance never quite faded. The stories that survived tell us about individuals whose names we know. They tell us about couples reunited after decades apart, about children who found parents they'd last seen as toddlers, about marriages that endured 40 years of separation and then continued for decades more. These stories are extraordinary, but they represent something ordinary too. They represent the basic human need for connection, for family, for love. That need couldn't be legislated away. It couldn't be beaten out. It couldn't be destroyed by systems designed specifically to destroy it. The enslaved people who married each other, who built families, who loved despite everything, were doing what humans have always done. They were just doing it under conditions that made every act of love simultaneously an act of impossible courage. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your own bed, in your own home, free to love whoever you choose and protected by laws that recognize your humanity, spare a thought for those who loved without any of those protections. Their marriages were real. Their families were real. Their love was as profound and complicated and beautiful as any love has ever been. They built something lasting out of stolen moments and jumped brooms and whispered vows in crowded cabins. They created traditions that survive to this day. They proved that even the most brutal systems cannot fully control the human heart. And maybe that's the most important thing to carry with you into dreams tonight. The knowledge that love has always found a way. Even in the darkest chapters of human history, people held onto each other, built families, maintained hope. They did it without guarantees, without protections, without any assurance that tomorrow wouldn't bring catastrophic loss. They did it because love is what makes us human. And humanity, as it turns out, is remarkably hard to destroy. You've just woken up in rural Alabama, 1935. The rooster hasn't crowed yet, but you're already awake because the day doesn't wait for black women. Your body aches from yesterday's labor and the day before that, and every day stretching back as far as you can remember. The mattress beneath you is thin cotton ticking stuffed with corn husks that crinkle when you shift. The cabin smells like wood smoke, lard, and the faint mustiness of clothes that never quite dry all the way. There's no running water. There's no electricity. The outhouse is 30 yards away in the dark, and you'll need to make that walk before the sun comes up. You swing your legs over the side of the bed, feet touching rough wooden planks that have been worn smooth in some places and splintered in others. The air is cool, not cold, but enough to make you reach for the shawl draped over the bedpost. Your children are still sleeping, 3 of them curled together on the other bed like puppies seeking warmth. Your husband left for the fields an hour ago. You can hear the distant sound of other men heading out, their voices low murmurs in the pre-dawn grey. Your day started the moment your eyes opened. Theirs started even earlier. Here's the thing about being a black woman in Jim Crow America. You weren't just living under segregation. You were living under layers of it. The law said you couldn't use white facilities, couldn't vote, couldn't testify against white people in court. But underneath those laws sat something older and uglier, the assumption that your body wasn't yours, your time wasn't yours, and your dignity was a luxury you hadn't earned. White women were fragile flowers to be protected. You were a mule to be worked. That's not metaphor. That's how the system actually functioned. Zora Neale Hurston would write that the black woman was the mule of the world, and she meant it literally. You carried what others refused to carry. You bore what others refused to bear. And you did it without the protection that society extended to almost everyone else. The cabin around you tells its own story. 2 rooms if you're lucky, 1 if you're not. Newspaper pages pasted on the walls for insulation. The headlines from years past now faded and yellowed, talking about events that happened in a world that barely acknowledges your existence. The gaps between the boards letting cold in winter and mosquitoes in summer. You've stuffed rags into the worst of them, but the wind still finds a way. The floor is bare wood that you scrub every Saturday on your hands and knees, keeping it clean enough that you can feel proud, even when you have nothing else to feel proud about. Your grandmother lived in a cabin like this after emancipation. Some things haven't changed as much as they should have. You cross the small room to the stove, a cast iron beast that dominates the corner. The fire from last night has died to embers, so you add kindling, blow gently until flames lick upward, and set the coffee pot on top. Coffee is a luxury, but you've learned to stretch it. Yesterday's grounds mixed with today's, producing something that tastes mostly like hot brown water with the memory of bitterness. But it's warm, and warm is something. You slice fat back, drop it into the skillet, and listen to it sizzle while you mix cornmeal and water for hoe cakes. This is breakfast. This is most meals, actually. Meat when you can get it, cornbread always, vegetables from the garden when they're in season. Hunger isn't a crisis. It's a companion you've learned to negotiate with. The garden out back is yours, one of the few things that truly belongs to you. Collard greens, sweet potatoes, tomatoes in summer, pole beans climbing up sticks you cut yourself from the woods. You know this soil intimately, which patches drain well and which hold water, where the morning sun hits first, how deep to plant each seed. Your grandmother taught your mother taught you, and you're teaching your daughter. This knowledge isn't in any book. It's in your hands, in the calluses on your palms, in the way you can tell by smell alone whether the soil is ready for planting. The garden feeds your family when nothing else does. In lean times, and there are many lean times, it's the difference between hungry and starving. You've developed a whole system for stretching food. Bones get boiled twice, sometimes 3 times, until every trace of marrow has given itself up to the pot. Vegetable scraps become stock. Stale bread becomes bread pudding, or gets crumbled into gravy to stretch it further. Nothing is wasted, because nothing can be wasted. You've learned to make poverty taste like love, seasoning beans with ham hocks until your children don't realize they're eating poor people's food. Other women in the neighborhood share recipes, trade secrets, compete gently over who makes the best cornbread or the smoothest sweet potato pie. In this small arena, you are artists. Your medium is limitation, and your masterpiece is keeping your family fed. By the time the children wake, you've already been working for an hour. You feed them quickly, braid your daughter's hair tight against her scalp because it needs to last the week, and check your son's shoes for holes that might need patching with cardboard. School exists for black children, but only barely. The building is a former church with a leaking roof and books so outdated they still reference presidents who died before your grandmother was born. The white school across town has a gymnasium. Yours has a wood stove and hope. Your children will walk 2 miles to get there, while white children ride buses that drive past without stopping. If your kids are late, they're punished. If they complain about the walk, you remind them that education is the one thing nobody can take away. You say it like you believe it. Some days you do. The hair braiding is its own ritual, passed down through generations. You part your daughter's hair with the end of a rat-tail comb, section by section, your fingers moving with practice speed. She sits between your knees on a low stool, trying not to squirm even when you pull too tight. You tell her stories while you work, the same stories your mother told you. Stories about clever girls who outsmarted foxes. Stories about ancestors who crossed impossible distances. Stories about a future where she won't have to bow her head to anyone. The braids are practical, yes, meant to last a week without attention, because there's no time for daily styling. But they're also armor. They're also identity. They're also love, woven strand by strand into patterns that connect her to everyone who came before. The schooling gap haunts you. You made it through 6th grade yourself, which was more than most in your generation. But you can see how the system is designed to keep your children in the same place you're stuck. The school year for black children is shorter, scheduled around planting and harvest, so they can work the fields. The teachers are dedicated but stretched impossibly thin, sometimes managing 50 students across 6 grade levels in a single room. Supplies are whatever the white schools threw away last year, chalk worn to nubs, maps with countries that don't exist anymore, arithmetic books with half the pages missing. And yet your children learn. They learn because their teachers refuse to let them fail. Because you drill them on reading and numbers at night by lamplight. Because the whole community understands that education is the long game, the slow escape route that might take generations to work. Miss Johnson, the teacher, is a woman you admire more than almost anyone. She went to a normal school 2 counties over, came back with a certificate and a mission. She makes $23 a month, less than half what white teachers earn, and she spends most of it on supplies for her students. You've seen her patch her own shoes with newspaper while making sure every child has a pencil. She boards with families in rotation because she can't afford her own place, which means she has no privacy, no space of her own, no life outside the classroom. But every morning she stands at that schoolhouse door, immaculate and fierce, ready to pour knowledge into children the world has already written off. Watching her, you allow yourself to imagine your daughter grown, standing at a door like that, changing lives the way Miss Johnson changes them. But you can't linger on the children's schooling because you have your own work waiting. 3 days a week, you walk to the Henderson house on the other side of town. Mrs. Henderson is a white woman who considers herself kind, which mostly means she doesn't yell as much as some employers. You cook her meals, clean her floors, wash her clothes, iron her husband's shirts until the creases could cut paper, and tend to her children with a gentleness she never extends to yours. You call her Mom. She calls you by your first name, or sometimes just girl, even though you're 34 years old with grey threading through your temples. The walk takes 45 minutes each way. There's a bus, but you'd have to sit in the back, and the white driver has a habit of pulling away while black passengers are still climbing on. Easier to walk, safer to walk. At least, your own 2 feet don't humiliate you. The route to the Henderson house takes you through 2 different worlds. You start in your neighborhood, where people wave from porches and children call out greetings, and the smell of breakfast drifts from every window. Then you cross the railroad tracks, the dividing line that might as well be a border between countries. The houses get bigger, the streets get paved, the lawns get greener because people have time and money to water them. You walk faster here, eyes down, making yourself small. White women clutch their purses tighter when you pass. White men look through you like you're made of glass. You've learned every shortcut, every alley, every path that minimizes contact. Some streets you avoid entirely because there are houses there where bad things have happened to women who look like you. The Henderson kitchen is where you'll spend most of your day. It's clean and bright, nothing like your own. Running water from a tap, an electric refrigerator that hums in the corner, a gas stove with knobs that click satisfyingly when you turn them. You're trusted to cook elaborate meals, but not to eat them. Lunch for you is whatever scraps you can take without being noticed. Cold biscuits and the fatty edges of ham that Mrs. Henderson trims away. You eat standing up quickly in the pantry where no one can see. Sitting at their table isn't just forbidden, it's unthinkable. The furniture in this house has a color line too. The work itself is endless. You wash dishes in water so hot it turns your hands red. Then you wash them again, because Mrs. Henderson found a spot on a glass. You scrub the bathroom on your knees, face close enough to the porcelain to count every speck, using cleaners that make your eyes water and your throat burn. You make beds with hospital corners, dust furniture that was already clean, polished silver that nobody uses. The labor isn't always necessary. Sometimes it's just performance, proof that you're earning your wage, evidence that Mrs. Henderson is running a proper household. You understand this game even if she doesn't. Your labor is part of her identity. Without someone to supervise, what would she do with her days? There's a particular cruelty to intimate knowledge of how the other half lives. You know exactly how soft Mrs. Henderson's sheets are because you wash and iron them. You know exactly how her bathroom smells like lavender and rose because you scrub it daily. You know the taste of the food you prepare because you test it for seasoning. Then watch the family eat while your own stomach growls. You go home at night to your corn husk mattress and your outhouse and your kerosene lamp, carrying in your body the memory of electric lights, and indoor plumbing and a gas stove that lights with the turn of a knob. Some days the contrast feels like violence. Other days you've gone numb to it. You're not sure which is worse. And here's where it gets complicated, because you're not just a worker in this house. You're also invisible and hypervisible at the same time. Mrs. Henderson will discuss her marriage troubles in front of you, like you're part of the wallpaper. She'll complain about her husband's drinking, her mother-in-law's criticism, her worry that she's getting fat. You nod, murmur sympathetically, keep scrubbing the pot in your hands. You know more secrets about this family than any of their white friends do. But if you ever repeated those secrets, if you ever presumed to have an opinion about them, you'd be fired and blacklisted before sundown. Your knowledge is power you can never use, so you file it away and keep working. Some days Mrs. Henderson gives you her old clothes. She presents them like gifts, and you're expected to be grateful. So you are. Outwardly at least. The dresses are usually stained or out of fashion, things she'd be embarrassed to donate to her church. You take them home and remake them, taking in seams, letting out hems, transforming cast-offs into something your daughter can wear to Sunday service. There's a particular humiliation in wearing your employer's discards, but there's also a particular triumph in making them beautiful. You learn to sew from your mother, who learned from hers, all the way back to slavery times when black women made clothes for the whole plantation, and then, in stolen moments, made something fine for themselves. The needle in your hand connects you to all of them. The children you care for in this house will never know how much of their raising was done by you. You're the one who heats their bottles. You're the one who walks them through nightmares. You're the one who teaches them to tie their shoes and say please and thank you. When they fall down, they run to you before they run to their mother. When they're scared, your voice is the one that soothes them. You love them in a way, because you can't help it, because children are children regardless of whose children they are. But you also know that one day these same children will grow up and call you by your first name, will expect you to step off the sidewalk, will become the same white people who see you as less than human. That knowledge sits in your chest, like a splinter you can't remove. The danger, though. Let's talk about the danger, because it's always there, humming beneath the surface like electricity in the walls. Mr. Henderson comes home for lunch sometimes. He's a big man, red-faced and loud, and he looks at you in a way that makes your skin crawl. Not every day, not even most days, but enough that you've learned to keep the kitchen island between you, to never be alone in a room with him if you can help it, to make yourself small and uninteresting and invisible. Because if something happened, if he decided to take what he wanted, who would you tell? The police? They'd laugh you out of the station if they didn't arrest you for lying. Your husband? He'd want to kill Mr. Henderson, and then they'd kill him, and your children would have no father. So you manage. You calculate. You develop a sixth sense for when to leave a room and when to stay still and when to laugh at jokes that aren't funny, because laughter is a kind of armor. This isn't paranoia. This is survival math that every black woman in Jim Crow America learned to do. The Tuskegee Institute documented over 4,700 lynchings between 1882 and 1968, and those were just the ones that got recorded. Many victims were black men accused of looking at white women wrong, but black women were lynched too, beaten too, assaulted too. The crime of being black and female was that you were seen as unrapeable. The law didn't recognize it. The courts didn't prosecute it. Your body belonged to anyone who wanted to claim it, and your only protection was luck, strategy, and prayer. You've developed a whole vocabulary of deflection, ways to refuse without refusing, ways to disappear while still standing in plain sight. You know how to make yourself seem older than you are, less attractive, less available. You wear your wedding ring prominently, even though it's just a thin band of brass. You mention your husband in every conversation. You develop a slight limp, a persistent cough, anything that makes you seem less desirable as a target. Other women share these strategies in quiet conversations, comparing notes like soldiers comparing battle tactics, because that's what it is, a war. And the enemy wears a friendly face and signs your paycheck. So you work through the afternoon with that knowledge sitting in your chest like a stone. You scrub floors on your hands and knees because Mrs. Henderson prefers it that way, says the mop doesn't get into corners properly. Your knees ache, your back screams. The lye soap cracks your hands until they bleed in the creases. But you keep working because the alternative is worse. $3 a week, sometimes $4 if Mrs. Henderson is feeling generous or if there's a party to prepare for. That money feeds your children, patches your roof, pays the poll tax that theoretically allows your husband to vote, though he never actually can, because the registrar keeps losing his paperwork. Every dollar is survival, and survival doesn't leave room for pride. By late afternoon, the Henderson children come home from their school, the good school, the one with new textbooks and actual science equipment. They're nice kids mostly. The youngest one, a girl about your daughter's age, sometimes follows you around the kitchen asking questions. What's that spice? Why do you tie your hair up? Can you teach me that song you were humming? You answer patiently because she's a child and doesn't know any better. But there's something that twists in your chest when you think about how different her life will be from your daughter's. She'll go to college. She'll have choices. She'll grow up believing the world is fair because for her, it mostly will be. The walk home takes longer than the walk there because your legs are tired and the evening air is thick with humidity. You pass through the white part of town first, careful to keep your eyes down, to step off the sidewalk if a white person approaches, to make yourself unthreatening in 100 small ways that have become automatic. A police car rolls past slowly, and you feel your heart rate spike even though you've done nothing wrong. Doing nothing wrong has never been protection enough. You know women who got arrested for sass, for looking uppity, for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The jail is not somewhere you want to go. Things happen to black women in that jail that don't get written in any report. Once you cross into the black part of town, your shoulders drop slightly. Here, at least you can breathe. The houses are smaller, shabbier, but they're yours. Neighbors wave from porches. Children play in dusty yards. The smell of dinner cooking drifts from open windows, fatback and greens and cornbread. The same meal echoing from house to house because everyone's working with the same limited ingredients. There's a church on the corner, white-painted clapboard with a steeple that leans slightly to the left. On Sundays, you sing there until your voice goes hoarse. And for those few hours, you feel something like whole. But tonight is Wednesday, and there's more work waiting. Your own house needs cleaning. Your children need feeding. The garden needs watering. Your husband comes home with dirt ground into every crease of his skin, exhausted from 12 hours of labor that paid him half what the white farmhands make. You heat water for him to wash, serve him the best portion of whatever you've managed to cook, and listen while he talks about his day. His voice is heavy with frustration he can't show anywhere else. The foreman called him boy. A white worker half his age got promoted over him. He knows things are unfair. He also knows there's nothing to be done about it. Not right now. Not without dying. So he swallows it down, same as you do, and you both keep moving forward because stopping isn't an option. Your marriage isn't the romance novels Mrs. Henderson reads. It's something harder and maybe more real. You and your husband are partners in survival, yoked together by necessity and children, and a love that's been weathered by forces neither of you can control. There are tender moments, his hand finding yours in the dark, his pride when your son brings home good marks from school, the way he still calls you pretty even when you feel worn to nothing. But there's also the weight of what you can't talk about, the fear you both carry, the anger you can't express, the dreams you gave up so long ago you barely remember what they were. Sometimes you look at white couples walking down the street, holding hands without worry, and you wonder what it would feel like to love without the shadow of terror hanging over everything. You worry about what this world is doing to your husband's spirit. He used to laugh more. He used to have plans. When you first married, he talked about saving enough money to buy your own land, maybe start a small business, build something that belonged to your family alone. 10 years later, you're still sharecropping, still owing more at the end of each year than you earned, still trapped in a system designed to keep you trapped. You see how the weight of it bends him. Some nights, he doesn't talk at all, just sits by the stove staring at nothing, his hands hanging loose between his knees. You don't know how to help him. You barely know how to help yourself. So you sit beside him in silence, your shoulder touching his, offering the only thing you have left to offer: presence, witness, the simple promise of not being alone. After dinner, you finally sit down. Your body feels like it's made of stones. Your feet throb, your hands are swollen. But there's mending to do. So you thread a needle by lamplight and start patching your son's pants while your daughter reads aloud from a school book, stumbling over words but trying so hard you could cry. This is the moment you live for, the quiet hour when your family is together and safe, and the white world feels far away. Tomorrow you'll wake up and do it all again. But right now, in this small circle of lamplight, you are enough. You have enough. You allow yourself to believe that somehow, someday, things will be different for your children. The medical situation deserves its own attention because it was its own special kind of horror. When you got sick, and you did get sick, because your body was worked past breaking on a regular basis, your options were limited. White hospitals either refused black patients entirely or relegated them to basement wards where care was an afterthought. The black hospital, if your town had one, was underfunded and overcrowded, staffed by dedicated physicians who had too many patients and too few supplies. A serious illness could bankrupt your family. An emergency might simply kill you before help arrived. You remember when your neighbor's boy got his hand caught in a cotton gin. The screaming could be heard 3 fields away. They loaded him in a cart and drove to the white hospital, the closest one, and were turned away at the door. By the time they got to the black clinic 20 miles further, the hand couldn't be saved. He was 12 years old and would spend the rest of his life learning to do everything with one hand because white doctors couldn't be bothered to treat a black child. Stories like this were common. Everyone knew someone who died or been maimed because of delayed care. You learned to treat what you could at home, poultices for infections, willow bark tea for fever, prayers for everything else. The old women in your community carry medical knowledge that has no formal name. They know which roots break fevers and which herbs ease childbirth. They know how to set bones and staunch bleeding and recognize the signs of illnesses they have no ability to treat. This knowledge came over on slave ships and survived because it had to. When doctors wouldn't come and hospitals wouldn't open their doors, this was what stood between your people and death. You've learned some of it yourself. Remedies passed from your grandmother to your mother to you. Your daughter watches you carefully when you prepare medicines, storing the knowledge against a future where she, too, might have no one else to rely on. Childbirth was particularly dangerous. Black maternal mortality rates were astronomical compared to white women's, not because your bodies were weaker, but because the system didn't care if you lived. Midwives delivered most black babies in the rural South, skilled women who'd learned their craft from grandmothers and great-grandmothers going back to slavery times. They did remarkable work with almost nothing. But when complications arose, when bleeding wouldn't stop or babies got stuck, there was often nowhere to turn. You'd hear about women who died in labor because the white hospital wouldn't admit them, or who lost babies because the doctor took too long to come to the black part of town. Every pregnancy was a gamble. Every safe delivery was a small miracle. You've had 3 children and 2 that didn't make it. The first loss happened early, a miscarriage, while you were working in Mrs. Henderson's kitchen. You finished your shift before going home because you couldn't afford to lose the day's wages. The second was a boy who lived 3 days before fever took him. You buried him in the church cemetery in a box your husband made from scrap lumber, and you planted flowers on his grave that bloom every spring. You don't talk about them much, these lost children, but they live in a corner of your heart that never stops aching. Other women understand. Almost everyone has lost someone. You share this grief in glances, in quiet conversations after church, in the way you hold other people's babies a little tighter because you know how easily they can be taken. And if you needed to prevent pregnancy, well, good luck with that. Contraception existed but wasn't easily accessible, especially for poor black women in the rural South. You might hear about diaphragms or douches from other women, whispered information passed along like contraband. Some women relied on extended breastfeeding to space their children. Others used herbal remedies of uncertain effectiveness. The rhythm method required counting days on a calendar, which required having a calendar and enough control over your own body to say no on the risky days, neither of which was guaranteed. So families grew larger than resources could support, and women wore their bodies out with pregnancy after pregnancy, aged before their time by the sheer physical toll of reproduction. Let's talk about the violence more directly, because it shaped everything. The threat wasn't abstract. It was as real as the ground under your feet. Black women in Jim Crow America lived with the knowledge that their bodies could be violated at any moment and there would be no justice. White men who assaulted black women faced virtually no legal consequences. Courts routinely dismissed cases or found defendants not guilty regardless of evidence. The assumption built into the legal system was that black women were promiscuous by nature, couldn't really be raped because you were always willing, or at least never unwilling in a way that mattered. This wasn't just individual cruelty, it was systematized impunity. And the violence wasn't only sexual. Black women were beaten, whipped, and murdered for infractions real and imagined. Speaking disrespectfully to a white person could get you killed. Being in the wrong place at the wrong time could get you killed. Existing while black and female in a space where a white person felt you didn't belong could get you killed. The famous case of Mary Turner in 1918 illustrated the depths of this brutality. 8 months pregnant, she spoke out against the lynching of her husband and was herself lynched, her baby cut from her body and stomped to death by the mob. This wasn't ancient history. This was within living memory. Women who survived into the 1960s and 1970s remembered these horrors directly. The terror was fresh. So you learned to navigate. You developed what scholars later called the culture of dissemblance, a protective practice of hiding your true feelings, your real opinions, your authentic self behind a mask of deference and compliance. You smiled when you wanted to scream. You said yes, ma'am, when every cell in your body wanted to say something else entirely. You made yourself smaller, quieter, less threatening, because visibility could be fatal. This wasn't cowardice, it was intelligence. It was the accumulated wisdom of generations of black women who'd figured out how to survive in a world designed to destroy them. But here's the thing that doesn't get talked about enough. Within this crushing system, black women built worlds. They created spaces of love and resistance and joy that white supremacy couldn't touch. The church was one such space. On Sunday mornings, you put on your best dress, the one you'd sewn yourself from flour sacks and imagination, and you walked into a building where your humanity was never questioned. The preacher spoke of freedom, using biblical language that everyone understood, had double meanings. The choir sang songs that had carried your ancestors through slavery and would carry you through this. For a few hours, you were seen. You were valued. You were beloved of God. The music alone was worth everything. Songs that had been passed down through generations, spirituals that encoded messages of escape and resistance, hymns that promised a better world even if you couldn't reach it in this life. When the whole congregation lifted their voices together, something happened that's hard to describe. The walls seemed to expand. The ceiling seemed to lift. For those few minutes, you weren't tired, you weren't scared, you weren't invisible. You were part of something larger than yourself, connected to everyone who had sung these songs before and everyone who would sing them after. The church gave you back your name when the world tried to take it away. Sunday was also the one day you could truly rest. After service, families gathered for meals, spreading food across makeshift tables in the churchyard or packing into someone's home. These were the moments when laughter came easily, when children ran wild without fear, when adults could set down their masks and be fully themselves. The women traded stories and recipes. The men talked politics in low voices, debating strategy and timing, and how long the current order could possibly last. Young people flirted under the watchful eyes of their elders. Old people sat in corners and remembered, their presence a living link to the time before. when things were even harder, and somehow people survived anyway. Women's clubs and mutual aid societies were another kind of sanctuary. Black women organized themselves into groups that provided everything from burial insurance to scholarships to emergency assistance for families in crisis. They raised money for schools, lobbied for better conditions, and created networks of support that stretched across communities. The National Association of Colored Women, founded in 1896, brought together local clubs into a national movement with the motto "Lifting as we climb." These weren't social gatherings for ladies with too much time. They were survival infrastructure, built brick by women who refused to wait for the white world to save them. And in your own home, in that small cabin with the corn husk mattress and the temperamental stove, you created something precious. You told your children they were smart and beautiful and capable of anything, even when the world told them otherwise. You taught them history that schools wouldn't teach, stories of resistance and triumph that proved black people had always been more than victims. You braided your daughter's hair and told her she was descended from queens. You looked at your son and told him his life mattered, preparing him for a world that would insist it didn't, while also preparing him to survive that world long enough to change it. The emotional labor was immense. You carried not just your own trauma, but the trauma of everyone around you. You were the one who held the family together when your husband came home broken by another day of degradation. You were the one who explained to your children why they couldn't drink from certain fountains, couldn't swim in certain pools, couldn't be children in the carefree way white children were. You were the one who absorbed the fear and the rage and the grief and somehow transmuted it into something your family could survive. This work is invisible in most histories. It was the most important work of all. Your body bore the evidence of all this carrying. By 40, you moved like a woman twice your age. Your hands were rough as leather. Your back never fully straightened anymore. You'd lost teeth because dental care was a luxury. You had pains you didn't mention to anyone, because mentioning them wouldn't help and might worry your family. The average life expectancy for black women in this era was significantly shorter than for white women, and the gap wasn't genetics. It was the accumulated weight of discrimination pressing down year after year until something gave out. But you kept going. Every morning, you swung your legs over the side of that bed, felt the rough wooden floor under your feet, and started again. You did it for your children, yes, but also for yourself, for the stubborn insistence that your life meant something even when everything around you said otherwise. You did it because giving up wasn't actually an option. The alternative to survival was death, and death meant the system won. So you lived, defiantly, exhaustedly, gloriously. The resistance took many forms. Sometimes it was the quiet sabotage of slowing down work, breaking things accidentally on purpose, taking small revenges that couldn't be traced. Sometimes it was the open defiance of women like Ida B. Wells, who documented lynching with meticulous fury and dared white America to look at what it was doing. Sometimes it was the organized resistance of the civil rights movement, which was built on the labor of black women long before it had famous male spokesmen. Rosa Parks didn't just spontaneously decide to keep her seat on that bus. She was a trained organizer with years of activist work behind her. The movement that changed America was planned in church basements and kitchen tables by women whose names most people never learned. And sometimes resistance was simply survival. Getting up each day, raising children, maintaining love in the face of hatred. These weren't passive acts. They were radical affirmations of humanity in a system designed to deny it. Every black woman who lived through Jim Crow and came out the other side with her spirit intact was a revolutionary, whether she ever marched in a protest or not. The night is settling in now, and you're finally lying down. The corn husks crinkle beneath you. Your husband's breathing has steadied into sleep. Through the thin walls, you can hear the sounds of the neighborhood quieting down. A dog barks somewhere. A baby cries briefly and is soothed. The air smells like wood smoke and the jasmine that grows wild along the fence line. Tomorrow, you'll wake before dawn and do it all again. The Henderson house, the scrubbing, the careful navigation of danger, the long walk home. It never ends, this work of staying alive. But tonight, in this small space you've carved out of a hostile world, you let yourself rest. Your body is tired in ways that sleep can't fix, but you close your eyes anyway. Maybe you dream of your grandmother, who was born in slavery and somehow survived to hold you as a baby and tell you stories about a time before the war. She used to say that freedom wasn't a place you arrived at, but a thing you built, day by day, choice by choice. One small act of dignity at a time. You didn't understand her then. You're starting to understand her now. Maybe you dream of your children grown and free, living in a world you can barely imagine, where they walk through front doors and drink from any fountain, and their children's children have never known the weight you carry. Maybe you dream of nothing at all, your mind finally empty, your body finally still. The Jim Crow era lasted roughly from the 1870s to the 1960s. Nearly 100 years of systematic degradation, terror, and oppression. And black women carried that weight every single day, in their bodies and their spirits and their bones. They carried it while also carrying families, communities, and the seeds of a freedom movement that would eventually bring the whole rotten system down. So tonight, as you lie in your modern bed, with your modern comforts, with laws that, at least on paper, say you're equal, with doors that open to you that once were closed, spare a thought for those women. The ones who scrubbed floors and bit their tongues and walked past buses that wouldn't stop for them. The ones who buried children and endured violations and still somehow found the strength to love and hope and fight. They built the world you live in now with their hands, their hearts, their impossible resilience. They didn't just survive Jim Crow. They outlasted it. And that's not just history, that's a miracle. One exhausted, stubborn, glorious day at a time. You're standing at the edge of a cattle ranch somewhere in Texas. The year is 1872, and you've just signed on for a drive heading north to Kansas. The sun is barely up, but the heat is already pressing down like a wool blanket soaked in sweat. You're one of maybe 8 or 9 black cowboys on this outfit, which isn't unusual. Historians estimate that roughly 1 in 4 cowboys working the cattle trails after the Civil War were black men, former slaves mostly, heading west because the alternative was staying in a South that wanted to keep you in chains by any means available. Sharecropping, convict leasing, the sudden appearance of laws designed to criminalize your existence. The West wasn't exactly welcoming, but it was somewhere else. And somewhere else was worth a lot in those years. Let's be clear about what you left behind. The war ended in 1865, and for a brief shining moment it seemed like the promises might actually mean something. Freedom, citizenship, the right to vote, to own property, to exist as a full human being under the law. But by the time you headed west, those promises were already curdling. The Klan rode at night, burning and lynching with impunity. State legislatures passed black codes that made it illegal to be unemployed, to gather in groups, to exist in public spaces after certain hours. The convict lease system fed black men into mines and plantations, where they died faster than they had under slavery, because at least slaves had been property worth preserving. You watched friends disappear into that system, arrested for vagrancy or loitering or looking at someone wrong, sentenced to years of labor that nobody expected them to survive. So you walked away. You didn't have much to take with you. The clothes on your back, maybe a few dollars saved from whatever work you could find. Skills you'd learned in bondage that might translate to something useful out west. You'd heard the ranchers were hiring, that they needed men who could ride and rope and weren't afraid of hard work. You'd heard the pay was decent and the color of your skin mattered less than what you could do. That last part turned out to be partially true, which in your experience was better than most promises. The trail boss squints at you, spits tobacco juice into the dirt, and assigns you your position. You're riding drag. Congratulations. That means you'll be eating dust for the next 3 months. Literally. Riding drag puts you at the back of the herd, behind thousands of cattle kicking up dirt with every step. The air is so thick with grit that you tie a bandana over your nose and mouth, and still end up coughing brown for weeks. Your eyes water constantly. Your clothes turn the color of the earth. Every breath feels like swallowing a handful of the Texas Panhandle. The white cowboys, they're riding point or flank, positions where the air is cleaner and the work is marginally less miserable. Funny how that assignment works out. Here's the thing about cattle drives. They were brutal for everyone. 16-hour days in the saddle, sleeping on the ground with one eye open for rattlesnakes, eating beans and hardtack until your stomach forgot what real food tasted like. But within that shared misery, there were hierarchies, and guess who consistently drew the short straw? Black cowboys got the worst horses to break, the most dangerous positions during river crossings, the night watches when everyone else was too tired to stay awake. The pay was supposed to be equal, roughly $30 a month, but somehow your envelope always seemed a little lighter than the others. Nobody explained why. Nobody had to. The horses they give you are the ones nobody else wants. Half-wild Mustangs with tempers like rattlesnakes, prone to bucking and biting and general mayhem. Breaking them is your job, which sounds almost glamorous until you're lying in the dirt for the 5th time that morning with a hoof-shaped bruise spreading across your ribs. The white cowboys watch from the fence, making bets on how long you'll stay mounted, laughing when you don't. When you finally do break the horse, when you spent days earning its grudging respect, someone else rides it on the actual drive. You get handed another wild one and the process starts over. You learn quickly that your value on the trail is measured differently than your white counterparts. You work twice as hard to earn half the respect. When you rope a steer faster than anyone else, there's a grudging nod. When a white cowboy does the same thing, there's backslapping and whiskey. You file this away alongside all the other small humiliations that add up to a life spent proving yourself over and over to people who've already decided what you're worth. The food on the trail deserves its own special mention. The cook, usually called Cookie regardless of his actual name, runs the chuck wagon like a small kingdom. Beans are the foundation of everything, supplemented by salt pork, hardtack, and coffee strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe. On good days, there might be dried fruit or molasses. On bad days, there's just beans, again, still, forever. You eat squatting in the dust, plate balanced on your knee, shoveling food into your mouth before the flies claim it. The other black cowboys cluster nearby, not because anyone tells you to separate, but because the alternative is sitting alone on the edges of groups that don't particularly want you there. Your stomach rebels at first, unused to the monotony and the questionable preservation methods. Dysentery runs through the crew like gossip. leaving men weak and dehydrated, still expected to work full days in the saddle. There's no sick leave on a cattle drive. You either keep up or you get left behind. And getting left behind in Indian territory with a bad case of the runs is not a survival strategy anyone recommends. The cattle themselves don't care what color you are, which is almost refreshing. A longhorn will gore you regardless of your ancestry. The work is honest in that way, purely physical, demanding everything your body can give. You become an expert at reading the herd, sensing when they're about to spook, knowing which ones will try to break away and which will follow docilely. Your horse becomes an extension of your body, responding to the slightest pressure of your knees, the subtle shift of your weight. There's pride in that skill, real pride, the kind that comes from mastering something difficult. River crossings are where cowboys die. The cattle don't want to enter the water, and once they do, they panic, thrashing and swimming in circles, creating currents that can pull a horse under. You're assigned to the downstream side, which means if anything goes wrong, you're the one catching the debris. Debris including panicked cattle, loose equipment, and occasionally drowning men. Last year, a cowboy named Thompson got his leg tangled in his rope during a crossing. The cattle on the other end pulled him under before anyone could cut him free. His body surfaced 3 miles downstream, bloated and unrecognizable. Nobody talks about Thompson much, but everyone thinks about him at every river. But then you ride into a town to resupply, and the pride curdles into something else entirely. Picture this. You've been on the trail for 6 weeks. Your clothes are stiff with dried sweat and cattle grime. Your beard is wild, and your hair is matted under your hat. All you want is a hot meal, maybe a bath, definitely a drink. The town appears on the horizon like a mirage, wooden buildings shimmering in the heat. You can almost taste the whiskey already. And then you notice the other black cowboys hanging back, waiting to see what kind of town this is, because not all towns are the same, and some of them would rather shoot you than serve you. Sundown towns, they called them. Places where black folks weren't welcome after dark, and often weren't welcome at all. No signs necessarily, just an understanding enforced by sheriffs who looked the other way, and citizens who kept their rifles handy. You'd ride in and feel the temperature change, the way conversations stopped, the way hands drifted toward holsters. Sometimes you could get supplies from a back door, paying extra for the privilege of being treated like a secret. Sometimes you couldn't get anything at all and had to ride on to the next town, hoping it would be different. The saloon is the center of social life in any Western town, the place where deals are made and news is shared and men blow off steam after weeks on the trail. You're not welcome there. Or rather, you might be allowed in through a side entrance, served at a separate section of the bar if the owner is feeling generous, or handed your drink through a window to consume outside like an animal at a trough. The piano keeps playing. The laughter keeps rolling. You stand in the dusty street with your whiskey and watch through the window as your white crewmates enjoy the evening you've all earned together. The bathhouse is another complicated negotiation. After weeks on the trail, you're carrying enough dirt to start a small farm. Your skin itches, your scalp crawls, and you can smell yourself in ways that suggest other people can smell you from considerably farther away. But the bathhouse has rules, written or unwritten. Sometimes you can use it after the white customers are finished, the water already grey and lukewarm. Sometimes you can't use it at all and have to find a creek outside of town, scrubbing yourself in cold water while keeping an eye out for anyone who might object to your presence in their general watershed. Some towns were better than others. Dodge City had a reputation for being relatively tolerant, though relatively is doing heavy lifting in that sentence. Black cowboys could sometimes drink alongside whites there, gamble at the same tables, visit the same establishments, but even in Dodge, you kept your head down and your voice quiet. You didn't complain about short change. You didn't look too long at anyone who didn't want to be looked at. Freedom in the West was always conditional, always provisional, always subject to revocation without notice. And let's talk about the women. Or rather, let's talk about how you weren't supposed to talk about the women, look at the women, or exist in the same general vicinity as white women without risking your life. The mythology of the frontier included tales of romance and courtship, dance halls where cowboys found sweethearts, weddings in little wooden churches. That mythology wasn't written with you in mind. A black cowboy who showed any interest in a white woman was a black cowboy who might not survive the night. The accusations that followed such interactions in the South had followed west too, packed alongside the settlers' furniture and prejudices. The violence was always there, simmering beneath the surface. You hear stories, around the campfire, always told quietly, about black cowboys who disappeared. A man named Jesse, who rode for the King Ranch, found hanging from a tree outside Waco, with no explanation and no investigation. A family heading for Oklahoma Territory, their wagon burned, their bodies left for the buzzards. A cowboy in New Mexico, who beat a white man in a fair fight and was shot in the back 3 days later by someone nobody could identify. The law wasn't interested in these cases. The law was often complicit in them. You find companionship where you can. Other black cowboys become your family, the people who understand without explanation, who share jokes in quiet moments, who watch your back when the crew gets drunk and resentful. There's an older man on your crew named Daniel, who's been working cattle since before the war, when he was still property. He knows things about horses and weather and land that seem almost supernatural, and he shares that knowledge with you in the early mornings before the others wake. It's an inheritance of sorts, passed from one generation of survivors to the next. There are a few black settlements scattered across the frontier, places like Nicodemus in Kansas, where former slaves built communities from scratch. When the drive passes near one, you feel something loosen in your chest. Here, for a few hours or days, you can walk without measuring your steps, speak without monitoring your tone, exist without apology. The people in these towns are farmers and merchants and teachers, building schools and churches and futures. They look at you with recognition, with welcome, with the particular warmth reserved for family long separated. You think about staying sometimes, hanging up your saddle and settling down, finding a wife, raising children in a place where they might be safe. But the pull of the trail is strong, and besides, these settlements have their own struggles. Drought and locusts and white neighbors who resent their presence and their success. Nicodemus will survive, barely, but other black towns will be destroyed by mobs or starved out by railroads that deliberately bypass them. Building something isn't enough if others are determined to tear it down. The work continues regardless. Rivers that need crossing, stampedes that need stopping, cattle that need doctoring. You become skilled at all of it because you have to be. Incompetence isn't tolerated in anyone on a cattle drive, but you suspect mistakes would be forgiven in others more readily than in yourself. So you make fewer mistakes. You anticipate problems. You become the cowboy that the trail boss relies on for the difficult tasks, not because you've earned particular respect, but because you've proven you won't complain and you won't fail. There's a man in your crew named Jackson who's been working these trails for 20 years. His hands are leather, his back is bent, and his eyes have seen everything the frontier can throw at a person. He tells you stories around the campfire when the white cowboys have drifted away to their own conversations. Stories about the early days after the war, when freedmen flooded west hoping to find what they'd been promised. 40 acres and a mule, they'd been told. What they found instead was hard land, harder work, and the same faces from back home wearing different hats. Jackson doesn't sound bitter when he tells these stories. He sounds tired, which is somehow worse. You learn that the cavalry units patrolling the frontier include black soldiers, the Buffalo Soldiers, who've earned a grudging reputation for toughness. Some of the cowboys you ride with served in those units before mustering out. They carry themselves differently, with a military bearing that hasn't quite faded. They've fought in campaigns against native peoples, which adds another layer of moral complexity to an already tangled situation. Black men enforcing the government's policies against indigenous nations who had their own complicated histories with slavery and freedom. Some tribes had held black slaves. Others had welcomed black refugees and intermarried with them. The West is full of these contradictions, alliances and enmities that don't sort neatly into the categories you were raised with. Your interactions with native peoples on the trail are tense and unpredictable. Sometimes you trade peacefully, exchanging tobacco or coffee for safe passage through territory that isn't really yours to cross. Sometimes there are confrontations, arrows and gunfire, and the terrible math of who gets to live on contested land. The cattle you're driving are part of the invasion, grazing on grass that sustained buffalo herds for generations, and everyone knows it. You're a participant in a displacement, even as you yourself have been displaced, caught in the machinery of empire without having chosen to be there. Summer turns to fall, and the herd moves north, through Indian territory and into Kansas. The nights grow colder, and you bundle into whatever blankets you own, which aren't many. Your pay hasn't stretched as far as you'd hoped. Prices in trail towns were higher for you somehow. The general store owner squinted at your coins like they might be counterfeit, charged you extra for supplies he sold to white cowboys at marked price. You didn't argue. Arguing was a luxury you couldn't afford. The cold gets into your bones in ways the heat never did. You sleep on the ground wrapped in a single blanket, saddle for a pillow, listening to the cattle low softly in the darkness. Prairie wolves howl in the distance, and sometimes closer than you'd like. The fire dies down to embers, and nobody wants to get up to feed it. So you all shiver until dawn turns the sky grey and the cook starts banging pots to wake the crew. Your joints ache. Your back never stops hurting. You're 28 years old and your body feels twice that. The cattle drive ends in Abilene, the railhead where thousands of longhorns will be loaded onto trains and shipped east to feed the growing cities. You've lost 15 pounds over the past 3 months, most of it in sweat and worry. Your horse is exhausted. Your body aches in places you didn't know could ache. But you made it, and that counts for something. The herd is tallied, the pay is distributed, and suddenly you're a man with coins in your pocket and no immediate obligations. This should feel like freedom. It doesn't, quite. You can't stay in the nice hotel. You can't eat in the restaurant that all the other cowboys are filing into, already shouting their orders for steaks and potatoes. You find a boarding house on the edge of town that caters to black travelers, run by a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who escaped from Missouri before the war. Her beds are clean, and her food is good, and her conversation is better. She asks where you're from, where you're going, whether you've got family. The questions feel like kindness, which has been in short supply lately. Mrs. Patterson knows things about the town that don't appear in any guidebook. Which merchants will serve you fairly and which will cheat you. Which streets to avoid after dark. Which deputy has a reputation for finding excuses to arrest black men on payday, knowing they'll have cash to confiscate. She shares this information matter-of-factly, the way you might share directions to the general store. Is just knowledge necessary for survival, gathered through years of careful observation and shared among those who need it. You consider your options. Another cattle drive in the spring, probably. Maybe try to save enough to buy some land, start your own small operation. It's been done. There are black ranchers scattered across the territories, men who built something from nothing despite everything working against them. Bill Pickett is making a name for himself as a bulldogger, wrestling steers with his bare hands and teeth. Nat Love has become famous enough that people actually know his name, though the dime novels about him are mostly fiction dressed up in fancy language. These success stories circulate among black cowboys like prayers, proof that maybe, sometimes, the West can deliver on its promises. But buying land is its own obstacle course. You need to file a claim, which requires literacy and paperwork, and interaction with government offices staffed by men who may or may not recognize your humanity. You need to improve the land, which requires capital you don't have, and you need to defend it, because a black man with property is a target. Neighbors might dispute your boundaries. Local authorities might find reasons to invalidate your claim. Or someone might simply decide one night that you don't belong there and take matters into their own hands. But for every Nat Love, there are 1,000 men whose names nobody remembers. Cowboys who worked their whole lives and died owning nothing but their saddles. Men who were cheated out of wages, driven off claims, buried in unmarked graves after disputes that were ruled self-defense by sheriffs who didn't investigate very hard. The frontier is littered with these forgotten lives, and you know your odds of joining their ranks are considerably better than your odds of becoming legend. You winter in Abilene, picking up odd jobs to stretch your savings, mucking stables, hauling freight, whatever pays and doesn't require you to be somewhere you're not welcome. The town contracts around you as the cattle season ends, becoming smaller and meaner, less tolerant of outsiders now that the money has dried up. A few incidents remind you not to get comfortable. A shove on the sidewalk. A drink knocked from your hand at the one saloon that serves black customers. Nothing worth dying over, so you swallow it and move on. The winter feels endless. You share a room with 3 other black cowboys, all of you trying to stretch limited funds until spring brings work again. You play cards, for matchsticks, tell stories that grow taller with each retelling, and try not to think too hard about what you're doing with your life. One of the men, a kid really, barely 20, talks about heading to California, where he's heard things are better. Nobody has the heart to tell him things aren't better anywhere, just different kinds of worse in different places. Spring comes eventually, as it always does, and you sign on for another drive. Different outfit this time, different crew, same work. The trail boss is a hard man named Wallace, who doesn't seem to care much what color anyone is as long as the cattle get delivered. This passes for progressive. You're assigned to wrangle the remuda, the herd of spare horses that follows the cattle drive. It's skilled work, better than riding drag, and you allow yourself a moment of quiet satisfaction before wondering what you did to earn it and whether it will last. The drive north follows a different route this year, avoiding some of the rivers that proved treacherous last season. You learn the landmarks, the watering holes, the places where grass grows thick and the cattle can graze contentedly. This knowledge accumulates in you like savings in a bank, something nobody can take away. You're becoming a real cowboy, not just someone who herds cattle, but someone who understands the land and the animals and the thousand small decisions that make the difference between a successful drive and a disaster. And yet, the small indignities continue. At night, when the crew circles the fire and passes around a bottle, it skips over you more often than not. When stories are told, yours aren't solicited. When the cook serves dinner, somehow you're always last in line and the portions are always a little smaller. None of it rises to the level of confrontation. All of it adds up to a clear message about your place in the hierarchy. One night, about halfway through the drive, a storm blows in with almost no warning. Lightning turns, the sky white and the cattle panic. Thousands of animals suddenly running in every direction. A stampede that could kill anyone caught in its path. You don't think. You just ride, pushing your horse into the chaos, trying to turn the leaders and get the herd circling back on itself. Other cowboys are doing the same, shadows in the strobing lightning, whooping and hollering and risking their lives because that's what the job requires. The thunder is so loud, it feels like being inside a drum. Rain comes down in sheets so thick you can barely see your horse's ears. The cattle are bellowing, a sound that seems to come from everywhere at once, from the earth itself. You're soaked through in seconds, your clothes plastered to your body, your hands so slippery on the reins that you're gripping more with prayer than skill. A steer goes down right in front of you, and your horse leaps it somehow. A miracle of instinct and athleticism that you'll remember for the rest of your life. The stampede breaks. The herd calms. When the sun rises, you count the losses. A few dozen cattle scattered, probably recoverable. One horse dead, crushed in the melee. And a cowboy named Peters with a broken leg from being thrown. You helped carry him back to camp, splintered his leg with whatever was handy, listened to his screaming until someone found the laudanum. Peters is white, and the way he grips your hand and thanks you through his pain feels like something genuine, something uncomplicated by all the usual calculations. But the moment passes. By the next evening, the hierarchy has reasserted itself. Peters is evacuated to the nearest town for proper medical care, and the rest of you continue north, and nobody mentions your role in the rescue or suggests it might earn you anything resembling equal treatment. The West is like that. Moments of genuine human connection floating in an ocean of casual cruelty. Never quite enough to change anything permanent. You think sometimes about what your life might have been if you'd stayed east. Sharecropping, probably. Working land that would never be yours for a share of the harvest, that would never be fair. Or maybe the factories in the northern cities. 12-hour days breathing cotton dust or foundry smoke. Sleeping in tenements packed with other workers just as desperate as you. Or prison, which was becoming increasingly common for black men accused of crimes that barely existed until they needed a free labor force. The West isn't good, but it might be better than the alternatives. Might be. The comparison is never as comforting as you want it to be. The drive delivers its cattle successfully. You're paid, this time the full amount, and you feel Wallace's eyes on you as you count the coins. Making sure you aren't going to complain, maybe, or making sure you know he's watching. You nod your thanks and walk away, already thinking about next season, already calculating how many more drives until you can afford a small piece of land somewhere. What you don't know, what nobody tells you, is that this era is ending. The open range is closing. Barbed wire is carving the frontier into private parcels. Railroad expansion means cattle don't need to be driven overland anymore. Within a decade or two, the cowboy as a profession will largely cease to exist, replaced by ranchers and railroad workers and the settled fence civilization that follows money wherever it goes. The skills you've accumulated so carefully will become obsolete. The freedom you've scraped together will shrink as the territories become states with laws written by men who don't want you there. You see the changes starting, even now. Fences appearing where open range used to be, forcing the drives to narrow corridors that bring their own conflicts. Farmers with shotguns protecting crops from trampling hooves. Railheads moving, making some towns boom and others wither overnight. The old-timers shake their heads and talk about how things used to be, which is what old-timers have always done. But this time they might be right. Something is ending, and what replaces it won't have room for men like you. And here's the cruelest part. When the story of the Wild West gets told in the century to come, you won't be in it. The dime novels will feature white heroes exclusively. The movies will pretend you didn't exist. The mythology of the frontier, the rugged individualism, the man alone against the elements, will be whitewashed so thoroughly that future generations won't believe there were ever black cowboys at all. Your labor will be erased. Your suffering will be forgotten. The 1 in 4 will become none in 100. Statistically impossible, historically invisible. Scholars will eventually try to correct the record. They'll dig through census records and hiring logs, find the receipts and the photographs, interview the descendants of men like you. By then, it will be too late for the story to reach most people. The cultural image of the cowboy will be fixed, and changing it will feel like arguing against gravity. Even now, saying 1/4 of cowboys were black sounds like exaggeration to ears trained by a century of Hollywood. So you ride the trail year after year, getting older and slower, watching the world change around you. The cattle drives shrink, the opportunities narrow. Some black cowboys drift into other work, becoming farmers or laborers or tradesmen, adapting as they've always adapted. Others, the ones who can't imagine any other life, hire on with the diminishing outfits that still need hands, working until their bodies give out, or the jobs disappear entirely. You sit by a campfire one last time, the embers glowing low, the stars spread thick overhead. Your back hurts. Your fingers don't close right anymore. Too many broken bones that healed crooked. The young cowboys on this crew don't know the things you know, and they don't particularly want to learn from you. The West is changing, and you're becoming a relic of something that barely existed in the first place. But you were here. You did this work. You drove cattle 1,000 miles through dust and flood and stampede. You survived trail towns that didn't want you and bosses who underpaid you, and a system designed at every level to convince you that you were worth less than you were. You made friends among men who understood, shared jokes that nobody else would get, built a life from scraps of opportunity and stubborn refusal to disappear. The mythology might forget you, but the land remembers. Every trail you rode is still there, worn into the earth by hooves and wheels, evidence that people passed this way. Your story is part of that evidence, whether anyone chooses to tell it or not. You were 1 in 4. You were essential. You were erased, but you existed. And no amount of forgetting can change what actually happened under that enormous western sky. So tonight, when you stretch out in your comfortable bed with your climate control and your streaming services and your groceries delivered without anyone questioning whether you deserve to buy them, spare a thought for the men who rode drag in the choking dust, who were last in line for everything except the hardest work, who built the West and then watched themselves be written out of its story. They deserved better than they got, and the least we can do now is remember they were there. 1 in 4, invisible no longer. Riding still, in some sense, across the prairies of memory, toward a horizon that keeps promising something better, and maybe finally starting to deliver.